Hello. When I was asked to speak about using the influence of storytelling to create greater social impact, I knew I should start by telling you a story. At the beginning of last year, I sailed over 2,000 miles from the Galapagos to Rapa Nui to investigate microplastic pollution in our ocean. And days later, I found myself flying over another ocean from glorious solitude on the island to enforced isolation as the pandemic storm clouds rolled in. And cast adrift in a colourless world of confinement, my mind started to roam. And one day I retrieved two old folders down from our attic. These were letters from 1927, notes and tattered century-old newspaper clippings, and they contained the insubstantial strands of evidence and speculation which none of my relatives had quite managed to spin together. And their quest, I was given to understand, concerns our ancestry and a lost inheritance, but overlooked by my predecessors in their pursuit of lost crests and crowns and country estates. My imagination was captivated by the story of one woman who was relegated to no more than a footnote in some of my grandfather's letters. Now, this story could so easily have been a fairy tale. Madeline is an orphan. She's a poor French Catholic brought up by nuns in a convent who captivates John, a rich Irish Protestant squire, and they marry in defiance of the religious prejudices of the day. And this, at least, is how the story begins. But there were no happy endings in the tale that my mother used to tell me of betrayal, bigamy, multiple deceptions, debtor's prison, religious discrimination, a lost inheritance, and a woman's life that fell apart at the seams. So with the flimsiest of evidence as my warp and speculation as my weft, the threadbare story of Madeline's life was not easy to refashion. And then one day, as I was disentangling the myths and half-truths and lies, I made an unexpected and surprising discovery. Madeline was a lace maker. She was soon abandoned by her husband and forced to support herself by the only skill that she knows, lace making. But the fine netting that she was twisting together was just too flimsy to support her family, and so she turned to mantua making. Now, mantua makers cut time and costs by disposing of patterns and toiles, and they started pleating and folding and pinning directly around a client's body. So Madeline, I discovered, was the 18th century equivalent of a fast fashion seamstress. Now, supporting yourself as a garment worker, as we know, has never been easy, not then, not now, and particularly not now when brands have deserted their workers, leaving millions vulnerable to the economic devastation of this perilous pandemic. And poverty and textiles are bound up together, for very few textile or garment workers throughout history have ever earned a living wage. It's unsurprising that if you look at the words for being poor or in a precarious state, you will find a myriad of textile connotations: threadbare, sewn up, fleeced, strapped, coming apart at the seams, hanging by a thread. At the best of times, a woman's wage as a lace maker or a seamstress will cover little more than basic food rations in those days, and garment workers were often forced to cluster together if they wanted to put a roof over their heads as well. And like garment workers today, Madeline lived in a cycle of debt, borrowing just enough to get by until she was paid and could make the necessary repayments to her creditors. And after her husband abandoned her, she had faith that sewing would save her, as so many garment workers do today. But the fragile network she had spun around herself and her two young sons was an inadequate cocoon. She fell increasingly into debt and twice ended up in debtor's prison. There's so much more to the story, and hopefully one day, like Rebecca, I will write a book about it as well. But in short, Madeline was an exploited, abused, indebted migrant garment worker who lived over 200 years ago. She is also my fourth great-grandmother. And Madeline walks around with me in my day job at Fashion Revolution now, as I've spent my evenings and weekends writing about her over the past year. She has helped to bring my work into focus, providing clarity for the way forward and binding me more tightly to the people who make our clothes. As I draw parallels, maybe to the press, maybe in my mind, between her story and the working conditions of millions of garment workers around the world, it reminds me every day that some things have changed very little for the people who make our clothes over the last 2 centuries. And I can't redress the wrongs of the past. All I can do is to tell Madeline's story, or as much of it as I can possibly untangle. And I never underestimate the power of a good story to alter the way in which we see the world around us, and to help change the future for other women like Madeline. I hope that this helps to illustrate that storytelling is powerful, and all of us will have a Madeline somewhere in our not too distant past, some sort of textile artisan, maybe even a lace maker. And moving forward to look at garment workers today, Fashion Revolution has been partnering with microfinance opportunities for over 5 years now. In 2016, they undertook the very first long-term field research into the lives of garment workers in Cambodia, India and Bangladesh, gathering data from 540 women. And the result was a really complex data set that paints a picture of wages and working hours, and factory conditions and family life and education and expenses. And now they're collecting information in Bangladesh as well. And the objective of this project is to help to inform government policy decisions, collective bargaining, brand and factory initiatives. But these data sets really need interpretation, and that's where storytelling comes in. Fashion Revolution not only created a podcast series, but we also communicated these stories on our blog. And a few weeks ago, we published the story of Sheila, who is a garment worker in Bangladesh. Sheila was forced to leave her home when sea level rise contributed to its destruction. Her parents, unable to afford to pay for her education, she eventually found her way into Dhaka, where she became a garment worker. And like Sheila, nearly 90% of the garment workers in Bangladesh migrate from somewhere else. My lace-making ancestor Madeline was also a migrant. And when we look at Sheila's story, it's tragic, it's mundane, it's uplifting, but it shows how socioeconomic inequality is leaving women and children at disproportionate risk from the impacts of climate change. At Fashion Revolution, we always weave a call to action into our stories, and we've seen huge success in changing industry behaviour and pushing for policy change. Right from the outset, we encouraged our community to ask the question, who made my clothes? Because back in 2013, when I saw the activists searching through the rubble of the Rana Plaza factory collapse to prove which brands were producing there, I knew that transparency was the first step to transforming the fashion industry. And we've seen the statistics. We know that back at the beginning, only 12.5% of brands were publishing their first-tier suppliers. Now it's over 40% of brands, and more brands are starting to publish their raw material suppliers, their processing suppliers as well. Now, I don't know about you, but I often struggle to remember these statistics. But what I do remember are the stories. For instance, we know that in Myanmar last year, 6 workers were terminated from their employment after forming a trade union. But using the clothing labels from inside the factory, industrial trade union members were able to check online and check against the supplier lists which the brands had published. And they could build a coalition of brands to reach a negotiated settlement with the supplier and bring these trade union leaders back in and move towards recognition of the union at factory level. Facts alone can leave people feeling disengaged, and it's all too easy to feel powerless and helpless in the face of all of this human exploitation and ecosystem degradation that we see around us today. But stories have a bigger impact and people remember them for longer. They're a much better way of drawing people in to take action. It has to be said at the same time that brands do have a tendency to feature inspiring or fluffy storytelling more than reporting on actual systemic impacts. And again, this needs to change. We also need credible, comprehensive data as well as compelling case studies. I don't have much time left to talk about my voyage to Easter Island, but one of the reasons I felt it was important to take part in this scientific research voyage was to bring the issues to life for our community. The ocean current that orbits the South Pacific Gyre into which we sailed takes its name from an explorer who revolutionised the way in which we see the natural world, Alexander von Humboldt. And he embraced a multidisciplinary approach. Art history, poetry, philosophy and politics, all of these were encompassed within his scientific methods. And his observations were tested as much by his body and his spirit as by his mind. Feelings were as important to his worldview as empirical evidence, emotions as essential as rational thought. In the great supply chain of cause and effect, nothing can be taken in isolation. As Humboldt himself said, everything hangs together. If one thread is pulled, the whole tapestry may unravel. And that's why, like Humboldt, I believe we need to recognise that everything is connected. And when we look at these complex, multi-layered global development issues that surround the clothes we wear, which involve politics and history and ethics and economics, I believe that we need to take the same kind of multidisciplinary approach. We need writers and poets, artists, designers, as much as we need scientists and economists. And in a world where we tend to draw a demarcation line between science and the arts, the subjective and the objective, we need to reconnect facts with storytelling, to talk about our emotions as much as emissions if we want to scale up behaviour change and work towards the day when equal rights for all people and for nature become a universal standard. Because really, when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, most of us will only protect what we value and love. Thank you.